Thank you for the introduction, Ron. And thank you for welcoming me so warmly to your community. I learned about the event several weeks ago, and I reached out to a friend who is from Minnesota and told him that I would be speaking in Minneapolis. And he texted back and said, "Oh, where are you going?" And I told him, well, it's a talk co-hosted by several organizations, including Dignity, and the talk itself is at St. Joan of Arc. And he replied, "Of course it is." And he explained some of the history of the parish, its commitment to social justice and the gospel, and said it made sense to him that you would be interested in a talk about the church's response to HIV and AIDS during a difficult time in our history. I was grateful to Julie for sending along the readings to me a couple weeks ago for today's Mass, and for her insight that the selection from Luke's Gospel that we'll hear today emphasizes mercy. I've been reflecting on this line, thinking about today: be merciful, just as your God is merciful. I know this parish, I've learned that this parish has a rich history of mercy when it comes to responding to the HIV and AIDS crisis. I've learned about Grace House, and I look forward to hearing more stories this afternoon. If you're able to join us at the event, it'll be conversational in nature. We'll be sharing stories. I'll be talking a little bit about my book, and I hope that some of you here will be able to share some of your stories from that time. But if you're not able to make it, I'll give you a really brief summary of what my book is about and invite you to pick up a copy and learn some of this history of our church. As Ron mentioned, I'm the national correspondent at America, the Jesuit magazine, and I cover the church in the United States. But why this book? So for a number of years when I started off reporting, I had been covering how the church approached LGBT issues. This was at a time when the debate over same-sex marriage was really heating up, and it was my job to consider what Catholics had to say about the topic. So I would report on what bishops were saying, what are priests and religious thinking, what are ordinary Catholics in the pews thinking about this issue. And part of it was the news cycle, but part of it was also a personal search for me. As a gay Catholic, I hadn't always felt fully welcomed in the institution. I felt isolated and alone because I didn't have others I could turn to for advice and guidance. And sometimes, as ridiculous as it sounds, I felt like I was the first person to be considering this reality. What does it mean to be an LGBT person in the Catholic Church? So through my reporting, I realized that I could learn how others had approached this sometimes difficult question and kind of help make sense of this personal search. And it was a few years ago at dinner with a priest friend. I was telling him about some of these questions I had and how I felt alone and isolated, and he told me a story from his ministry that I hadn't known. I had known him pretty well at this point, but I didn't know about this particular moment in his ministry. As a young priest, he was working on a college campus in Toronto, and he began to hear that the students and faculty were being affected by the HIV and AIDS crisis, at that point still a relatively new phenomenon. And he heard that the community didn't have a place to meet, to share stories, to grieve with one another, to simply be around people who understood their challenges, and he offered the use of the Catholic chapel on campus. So the group began meeting there, and more people came to the meetings each week when the bishop found out and called my friend into a meeting. And the bishop urged him to shut down the group because he feared it was sending a signal that the church was lending support to the gay community, that it was maybe approving of the fight for gay rights. And my friend said no. He pushed back and said that he felt this was a pro-life ministry because people were dying and the church had to respond. So it was a small contribution, but my friend suggested that perhaps there was something there. Perhaps if I uncovered some of this history that I hadn't known before, there would be similar stories of priests, sisters, lay Catholics who responded with compassion and mercy to the gay community during the earliest times of the HIV and AIDS crisis. So for the next several years, I spent time in archives researching this history. I found names and made phone calls, asked people to share their stories with me. I interviewed dozens and dozens of people who generously told me about their experiences from that time. And the result is the publication of a book that came out late last year. I thought I would share one story with you about a Catholic sister from Southern Illinois. She had been an ER and ICU nurse, switched to home care nursing because she needed something a little less intense. And she began to be assigned patients, young men mostly, who had moved out to the coast, but once they became sick, moved home, and had to tell their parents three things: that they were gay, that they had AIDS, and that they were dying. And Sister Carol was upset because there wasn't much she could do to help. She was used to solving problems as a nurse, and in these instances, because there was no medical interventions available, she simply felt like she had not much to offer. But rather than give up, Sister Carol sought out resources, she attended workshops, she eventually moved to New York City for 6 months, where she worked on AIDS floors at Catholic hospitals, volunteered on an AIDS hotline, embraced the gay community, and learned how she could respond. And it was tempting at first when I learned Carol's story to frame her as a sort of nurse nun hero, someone who reached out to the gay community and offered some much needed support. But Carol's insight helped me see that it was actually a two-way street, that Sister Carol reaching out to this community helped her broaden her understanding of her Christian faith. She said it made her a better Catholic because she understood God's love in a new way. And I've been thinking, if I had known some stories like this as I was considering my own questions about what it meant to be an LGBT person of faith, I might have felt less alone knowing that there were people like Sister Carol in our tradition. I know it's not easy for anyone to be Catholic, that there's challenges that come from being part of an institution that at times can feel alienating, and knowing stories like Sister Carol's, I hope will offer some inspiration and insight no matter where you are on your journey. So for the past several months, I've been on the road sharing some of these stories, being part of a conversation about how the church responded during this time. And I was encouraged a few months ago when I was in New York, giving a talk to a similar community, when I noticed at the end of the talk, as we were milling around afterward, there was a group of young people in their 20s, and I went over and said hello, and they told me that they hadn't known any of this history. They hadn't known about things like Grace House or other Catholic ministries that responded with compassion and care. And as LGBT Catholics themselves, they had had similar feelings, and now, because of the stories they had learned, they had felt less alone. So I've been fortunate through my work to realize that there were others who came before me who helped create communities that are welcoming, just like this community. And I'm eager to continue this conversation that we've been having the past few months later today, so I hope you'll be able to join us and we can all consider where God's mercy has been at work in our church. Thank you.